Go.
Thank you. Hello again. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Well, I really am delighted to have the opportunity to be here. And maybe after all those technical difficulties, I'm especially grateful to be here and have the chance to engage with all of you and share my life's work on this research. It really is something that I've become very passionate about, and I'm always eager to engage with practitioners and share some of the wisdom that I've had the opportunity to gain from working with and studying many of these successful networks. So I thought I'd begin with a bit of background on how I came to do this research and some broader context so you understand where the principles come from, because it actually will help you understand how the principles were derived and how they could operate in practice. So instead of the ideas coming to me from the ivory tower, as you might have imagined, the work really emerged early in my career as I was starting out as a junior faculty member at Harvard Business School. I was new to the field of nonprofits, in fact, and was a new faculty position in the social enterprise group at Harvard Business School. And since I had earned my doctorate in a business school, my expertise was not in nonprofits at all. So what I became very good at was listening and learning to other people that I was meeting, particularly those practitioners and our students who had deep experience in the field of social impact work. And what was happening at the time, this was early 2000, there was a tremendous amount of interest in innovation, growth, startup, and scale of new nonprofit organizations. And it was kind of this model of let's find the silver bullet solution and scale it and solve these problems that have been in our midst for centuries. And I think there was no lack of hubris in the way that we were going about it at the business school. And what ultimately happened was I was also doing some work on how to scale organizations, simply because that's what everybody seem to be focused on. At the same time, there was the opportunity to work with executives in our executive education program, and there was a lot of interest in those organizations of how do these large organizations that many of them came from, large global corporate type nonprofits that were the Boys and Girls Clubs or Habitat for Humanity or Red Cross, the Nature Conservancy, how could those large scale organizations get the organizations to function effectively, both headquarters getting along with field operations communicating effectively with each other so that the sum of the whole was greater than the individual parts. And that was what I was hearing from a lot of the participants in executive education. And those two phenomena were very interesting to me in the sense that here we had a lot of new organizations, new innovations, and interest in growth and how we scale those organizations. And on the other hand, we had a lot of organizations that had already won at this growth game. They had become large corporate entities with far-flung operations nationally, internationally, and become kind of household names. And it seemed to me that maybe growth wasn't the only path that should be followed to get to impact, because perhaps there was an alternate route. And the way I began thinking about this was because I also had the opportunity to explore in my case writing for my course on social entrepreneurship and nonprofit leadership, had the opportunity to explore a lot of different case examples. And there were a few that really stood out to me because these organizations weren't trying to grow to scale. They were just trying to pursue the mission by working alongside others and investing in their peers and partners. And so those became my issue area and my interest because they seemed so unusual in the context that I was working in. So I wanted to share one of those case examples with you to give you a better sense of how these principles operate in practice. So I'd like to introduce you to Yusri Makar, who's the gentleman pictured in the back with the glasses. And he is here pictured with a Habitat for Humanity Egypt family whose home is going to be raised and rebuilt with a Habitat loan. And Yusri Makar is the national director of Habitat for Humanity Egypt. And it's quite an interesting story as to how he became national director of the organization. He's a civil engineer by training, decades of experience in the housing sector, both private sector and nonprofit. And when he was recruited to become the executive director of the country program in Egypt, He had just become promoted as a partner in the commercial construction firm that he was working for that was building the multi-million-dollar high-rises in Cairo. But Yosri was interested in the job because of the opportunity for impact and said he wanted to take a tour of some of the work that Habitat was doing and the needs that were being addressed. So Yosri went on a tour of the countryside and saw village after village of these primitive mud brick homes with no running water, no electricity. They're thatched with the cast off from the farm, and they were often shared with livestock because those were often the family's most valuable possessions. And he saw, after all of these houses that he was visiting, there were instances where he said there was one case where he saw a 250 square foot home, and he said, I could not believe I lost count at the number of people, at 20 of the number of people who were living in that 250 square foot home. And so he began to reflect and realize that even though his expertise was in housing, he was a native of Cairo, was born and raised in Egypt. He said, even though housing was my profession, I didn't know anything about the housing needs of my country. So he decided to take the job and to address the Habitat mission and pursue the mission of eliminating poverty housing in Egypt. And some of you may be wondering, well, this is an interesting case, except that maybe it's hard to relate to because Habitat International is such a large global organization. And of course, Habitat Egypt would be likely to succeed because it's working under the auspices of Habitat International. What's interesting, though, is on the ground, Yosri faced a very, very different reality, which was a tremendous need in the country. There were 20 million of the 70 million living in Egypt that were living in poverty housing situations like you saw pictured previously. So the need was enormous. The other was that there were tremendously limited resources. Yosri was the first paid staff member in the organization, and he was given a $250,000 US dollar budget to address that need. Then, of course, Habitat is a global brand, but in Egypt, it was not even legally registered to operate as a nonprofit. So it could not legally operate as an independent organization, but had to work in partnership with an existing legally registered organization. And the brand recognition of Habitat, as many of you likely know, it's a Christian-based organization. So if anything, the brand recognition in that Christian association in a predominantly Muslim country was a big liability for the organization. And then finally, in Egypt, there are about 16,000 to 17,000 nonprofit organizations. Egypt is one of the largest recipients of international aid money from the US, and there's a lot of different types of organizations competing for resources, both human and financial, to get their organizations off the ground and really serve the needs that they're set up to meet. So this is a universal challenge we see in many nonprofit sectors: a lofty mission, huge degrees of competition, and very, very limited resources relative to the scale of the problem. So that's what Yusri was faced with. And the way that he pursued the mission, though, was quite interesting, because one might think you should have maybe lower ambitions given that you're facing all of these challenges. In fact, instead, Yusri really sought a very different model, which was this methodology, as he describes with an Egyptian proverb, is that the basket that has two handles should be carried by two people. So the model looks in a very simple way, something like this. So typically a Habitat International program would focus on housing, and they would seek to mobilize financial resources, recruit a nonprofit board, and begin to hire some staff with a very small budget, and grow their own organizational infrastructure to build a Habitat affiliate to deliver the housing programs. And similarly, there were other organizations in the field trying to address other types of issues like economic development, education, or healthcare. But ultimately, the root cause of poverty housing is a combination of all of these. So typically, we would see Habitat working on the housing piece and not really working in concert with these other organizations. And likewise, the other organizations were working on their small piece without a whole lot of collaboration. Instead, what Yosri sought to do was focus on the mission first and explore what relationships and organizations, resources were already mobilized in the field in community development. And how could he plug in that housing piece fill in the gaps, and additionally invest and build greater capacity in that set of organizations in order to enable them to do housing as well as do all these other things that they were already doing, but to do them better. So he found and began to work through a network of 15 indigenous community-based organizations that were already addressing many of the needs in housing, education, economic development, and healthcare. But oftentimes, and most often, they had a gap in the housing piece. But of course, that's what Habitat Egypt was quite strong in. So that was where they could add value, both financial capital, but also the engineering and program expertise. And that's exclusively how they worked. So they really bypassed the traditional model of Habitat, of building the organization before you deliver housing programs, and really sought to build from what was already on the ground in the communities. So the results of that were actually quite amazing. They built 600 houses in the first year of working like this. This was in 1998. So that was the first to scale up in the world of any Habitat affiliate. And the typical country program, when done from kind of the ground up approach of building the organization infrastructure first, it would take years to get into the double digits of house numbers. And again, Habitat Egypt was able to build 600 in the first year of operation. They have since grown the number to 1,000 and now are building over 2,000 houses per year. In addition, they have had tremendous effectiveness in the program. Repayment rates in Egypt have been around 99% and above. The typical repayment rates for Habitat affiliates outside of the US and Canada are usually on the order of 75%. So you compare 99% repayment rates versus 75% of other country programs of Habitat in other contexts. So it was remarkable that they were getting the fastest scale up and the fastest repayment rates. And then they identified a number of synergies between programs where oftentimes their community partners had already developed strong microfinance programs, which were run in a similar way because there was a revolving loan program where people would repay the loan, and of course that enabled them to make more new loans. And that is really how Habitat operates, is they have a revolving fund of capital that enables them to use that money to build new houses or remodel homes, and then those mortgages are repaid, and then Habitat's able to do more. So what they found was the partners that have a strong microfinance program could immediately implement the housing program and really build on the competencies that they already had. And at the same time, there were often a building boom in the communities that Habitat Egypt was working in, where they would be building hundreds of homes at a time and remodeling and upgrading the living situation of many people in the community. So that actually created new business opportunities for the microfinance program. So they could become entrepreneurs in providing electrical supplies or building materials for the community members. So the microfinance program and the housing programs were actually reinforcing each other. And then finally was this approach of a very different model of community development, where instead of dictating what the program should look like and having the partner work as a grantee in some respects and just deliver on what they're contracted to do, Habitat was really playing a support role to their community partners and investing in the staff capacity to identify local needs, in their case housing, but of course if you're good at identifying a housing need, you may also apply that knowledge and expertise to other needs in the community. And then they became very good at identifying programs or ways locally to address those needs. So it wasn't just Habitat telling their partners what to do, but really working alongside them as in a support role to enable the communities to identify how the housing program could be customized and adapted to best serve their needs in the community. So then the Habitat partners often said working with the Habitat program actually helped to give them a name and confidence that they could identify community needs and begin to mobilize resources and attract capital to address them, rather than being passive beneficiaries and just doing what's dictated by funders. So the effectiveness of the program was leaps and bounds greater than just the house numbers themselves. And finally, they had tremendous sustainability, that some of the partners were adopting the programs internally, so much so that in some cases, one of the partners had asked, well, the Habitat model requires that we repay the loans because it's a revolving fund of capital. But what about the poorest of the poor in our communities? They have needs that are being unmet and they're not being met by your program. Is there anything that we could do to serve the poorest of the poor who can't even repay a mortgage and a Habitat loan? And so some of these partners developed programs where they were able to take the money they typically would add to the Habitat housing program. Habitat allowed them to take that capital to instead develop a program to provide housing for the poorest of their poor in their communities. So interestingly, that program created a greater fundraising burden on Yosri Makar and his own team because they were foregoing some capital, although only 5% of the amount that was needed to run the housing programs. And so Yosri had to fundraise and make up for that gap. But at the same time, he said that was actually tremendously valuable because they were adopting the values we wanted them to have, which was identifying community needs and developing programs to serve them. And if we had to infuse a little bit of capital in the beginning to help them get off the ground, that was great for values transfer because we could enable them to be better at solving their own problems over time. So the other thing that's quite remarkable is that over time, some of these partners could attract their own funding and didn't need support from Habitat Egypt. They had all the capacity within their own staff to deliver the housing programs on their own and could actually exit the program or the partnership with Habitat Egypt, and Habitat could take those resources and work with a new community. So there was actually an exit strategy. There wasn't the expectation that partners or part of Habitat Egypt's network were there forever and were going to require this ongoing support and subsidy. So that's the impacts in a nutshell. And this is just one example of about a dozen that I've studied over the past 15 years that illustrate amazingly powerful impact without necessarily growth or scale of the organization, but rather a very deliberate investment in building the capacity in the field and working alongside peers and partners to develop that capacity to deliver on the mission. So what I found was it's actually quite remarkable across a range of sectors, whether we're looking at human services, international development, climate change, microfinance, education, whether it's large-scale organizations, very small startup, grassroots organizations, or foundations versus operating nonprofits. They're vastly different organizations in very different contexts with different issue areas that they focus on, but they're fundamentally working in the same way. And that's what I found quite amazing. And that is actually where these 4 principles have come from, is that across all of these different types of organizations, they all demonstrate an adherence to a set of principles that is the principles that I'm going to share with you today. And I thought the best way to illustrate the principles was to use the case study to illustrate everything. So the mission, not organization. Habitat Egypt did not focus on building an organization and an infrastructure at all. They bypassed that model and instead said, how can we work with what's already there and invest and infuse our efforts and resources into what people already want to do and help give them a jump start and at the same time add our program in, and we get leverage on our resources and greater impact. Second is this notion of trust, not control. There's a tendency in the field, particularly amongst funders, where to get high performance and high quality outputs, impacts, you really need to have very, very clearly defined metrics, performance measurement systems, control mechanisms to ensure that you get good quality. Habitat Egypt did exactly the opposite. And similarly, I've seen this in other case examples, is that the partners, the members of the network begin to see their interests as aligned and mutually reinforcing. Habitat Egypt succeeds when their partners succeed. There's a high degree of trust amongst the partners and they work alongside each other as peers. And so Habitat was able to invest its resources, financial capital, and its human capital and expertise in housing programs, but gave a lot of control to its own partners and had them help design and run the programs from homeowner selection to collecting on the loans. That was all left to the partners, and that's how they got to these high repayment rates. In fact, there's an example where UC shares that the revolving loans, the funds would be frozen if repayment rates dipped below 95% in any given community. And so there would be instances where a loan was denied to a member of the community because the neighbors had not repaid. So at Friday prayers, they would go and announce, and they had an open microphone and would say, I have not gotten my Habitat loan because this neighbor and this neighbor and this neighbor have not repaid their loans. And then by Saturday, those loans would be repaid. So here, by giving up more control and allowing the community themselves to operate the program, they got dramatically higher repayment rates because it was mutually reinforcing. Community members knew who was accountable and who should be held accountable when results weren't being met. So it was even more effective than it was when Habitat controlled all aspects of the program implementation. Finally, there was an element of emphasizing humility and not having all the answers or all the resources to solve the problem. And it wasn't about building Habitat Egypt as an institution or as a brand in the country. In fact, when Habitat was celebrating its 6,000th house, there was a big celebration in the community, and they had local and national government leaders and funders attending a ceremony, and Yosri was invited to come on stage and say a few words about his organization's amazing accomplishments. And Yosri invited all of his partners who were in attendance to come join him on stage. And he simply said, "This isn't Habitat. We are simply providing support." So that degree of humility really greases the wheels of the network in the sense that everybody wants to contribute because they know that the impacts that are achieved are shared by all the members of the network. It's not about jockeying for position and trying to become the leader or the dominant player in the field. And finally, this notion of a node versus hub. I know that sounds kind of academic, like academic jargon, but I have an illustration that will give you a clear idea. And you don't need to get your eyes examined. I know this slide is very, very small print, but I put two slides together so that you could see the juxtaposition of two slides. These are actually from Habitat International's planning documents from a few years back when they were trying to bring in some of Habitat Egypt's network model into their global operations more broadly. And the shift is really quite dramatic. Typically, Habitat, as I described earlier in the presentation, was focused on Habitat is the organization at the center. That's the slide on your left. And all of its partners and stakeholders were arrayed around the organization, and the way they interacted was how they engaged with Habitat, the institution. In contrast, the second slide on the right is really illustrating where Habitat is putting the mission at the center of its work, and it is one of many other players that are focusing on these efforts. And therefore, their work is important, but not central to certain solutions in certain communities because it's not likely to be a one-size-fits-all approach. So this is actually a big mindset shift in the way that we think about our work, from an organization as the vehicle for change to a network as the vehicle for change. And that is really that shift in thinking from a node to thinking of yourself as a node, not as a hub. So with that, I think we can turn to the questions from our panelists.
Great. Thank you, Jane. This is amazing what you're sharing, and I think it'll have implications for everyone on the line in different ways. So I will invite the other presenters to turn their cameras back on and join us. And we'll go to Jose, who's going to talk with you first.
Hi.
Here we go. Great. I hope you can hear me okay. So first of all, thank you so much, Jane. Really appreciate this. For our first question, thinking about this idea between collective impact and what you just mentioned on the 4 principles and how those 4 principles are all essential. Got a lot of the work that even I'm doing with the theme outdoors and what we're trying to do to have a collective impact with measurable outcomes. So how would you, because the question comes up that how are these different and related? So what can you tell us about what is the relationship between these 4 principles you mentioned and collective impact?
Sure. So I would, first, it's a great question. I get this question often, and I would say that the case that's made for collective impact is very much the same as a case for network leadership. And in fact, this need for complex solutions that are cross-organizational, cross-sector, I think that's become well accepted in the field. And I absolutely think that collective impact is very complementary to this work, or rather perhaps network leadership principles are very complementary to collective impact, in the sense that I would say that for any collective impact effort to succeed and to have a culture in which the members of the collective are working in concert and really trust and assume that the achievements of the network are going to be shared amongst the parties, that this set of principles actually needs to be well established amongst participants in a collective impact effort. So in fact, I have a guest blog on FSG's website, Foundation Strategy Group, describing exactly this relationship between the 4 principles and networking, collective impact. But basically, we come at it from somewhat different perspectives. So collective impact is a very structured approach to collaboration, where there are systems, a backbone infrastructure, and that's the way, and funders provide a pot of money to enable this collective impact effort. The networks that I've looked at are almost, they achieved their impacts without necessarily any formal backbone infrastructure or systems for collective impact in place. In fact, none of them had that, which is not to say they couldn't have benefited from it, but they came at it from sometimes bilateral relationships to multilateral relationships that began to snowball, and people working in communities with each other and finding the impacts are synergistic over time, that they began to build a network. So instead of kind of a funder driving a collective with backbone infrastructure, these are networks that kind of emerged from the bottom up and began to achieve some of the impacts that a collective impact effort might like to achieve. So again, they're very complementary, but we come at it and look at the different perspectives. I really emphasize the leadership and the culture and the norms of how people behave, how network members engage with each other. And I think even collective impact has shifted and evolved over time, where they've looked at the concept of emergency and complexity and system leaders. And you'll find, if you take a look at that, that looks a lot like much of the work that I've been doing. Also, our work is converging in some ways, where there's an understanding is that the systems need to be in place, but the culture and the leadership and the norms also need to be in place.
Great. Thank you so much. And I appreciate how you mentioned about the system.
Thanks, Jane. And we'll go to Kathy next. Oh, we lost Kathy's video. Do we have your audio, Kathy?
Well, since it's up there, maybe I should just jump in. So I would say one of the biggest barriers is that there's a tendency to want to get to kind of solutions and action immediately. And there perhaps isn't as much investment first, even on the front end, of doing due diligence to find trustworthy partners and making sure that the people around the table are people who have a commitment and a track record for playing well with others in sandbox, right? That there's such a focus. And of course, the needs are tremendous in so many fields that there's a pressure to just go into action and solve problem solving. But there's a lot of due diligence required. In the Habitat Egypt case, they spent six months roughly in many cases to do due diligence on their partners before they brought them into the network. So they would go into communities and find out which community-based organizations are serving your needs best. And they would, in fact, go out of their way to find the most marginalized members of the communities, the widows in the communities, and find out which organization has been serving your needs. And if they knew that the community-based organization was true to its mission based on its track record, they wanted to work with those types of organizations that were in it for the impact, to serve the needs of the community, not for any prestige or status that might come from a big grant or an institutional success, that really they sought the right partners. And then second was building relationships. They had kind of trial activities where they would invite a potential partner to come to a neighboring community and participate in a build, get to know the parties, get to know the people in the community, and see their level of commitment. And that would take place over several months and really start to build the relationship amongst participants so that they could trust each other, because that investment in relationships, human, authentic relationships that create the trust, are absolutely essential to building collaborations and successful collaborations. And I think oftentimes funders put pressure on their grantees to get results quickly on a very short timeline with a very clearly defined set of goals and metrics and outcomes over that period. And the reality with networks is you always have to invest, and it's an ongoing investment in building and maintaining those relationships. And people often think of that as maybe the soft stuff that isn't critical to the work, but in fact, network building and building those relationships is part of the work, because that's what enables the work to happen effectively in a collaboration. Oh, I'm not hearing you either, Avery. But
sorry we lost you, Kathy. Is there anything you wanted to say? Why don't you field this question, and then we'll come back to Sarah for the last question.
Sure. So as far as the principles, I don't really think of them as distinct rules to follow, but rather, as I described to you, they emerged from my study of all of these successful networks that had often created themselves or been catalyzed by leaders and their organizations in a peer group, a community of leaders from the ground up. And these four principles are just how they work. So I would say they're all intertwined. And in fact, sometimes it's hard to distinguish between the four. And it really is a set of norms and values and behaviors of how people engage with each other in collaboration. And so they're hard to pull out individually to say this works here and this doesn't work here. It's really, this is the pattern that I've seen that seems to resonate with the practitioners themselves, because I've shared these principles and tested them on all of these practitioners and network catalysts that I've learned from, to see how relevant or true these principles were to their practice. And they say that is actually a very articulate way to capture what they've been doing. So they really are kind of part of a whole, and it's a kind of a culture that all of these networks have.
Great, thanks. Well, we have one final question, and then we'll hear from each of our panelists, and Jose's going to pose this one.
Great. Hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
So this one, I mean, I think you've been mentioning the role of funders a lot, and a big concern for especially small startup nonprofits is that question of how does funding drive this, but also how you don't want the funding to drive this. So
Right.
how do you continue to frame this work so that funders understand the importance of this work?
Yeah, so that is something that I continue to be more and more engaged and interested in doing, because I think that this approach is so powerful and has such tremendous potential for achieving transformational change in so many issue areas that I've become more proactive in trying to engage with funders and practitioners, nonprofit leaders, to explore this. So given my experience, I think the most compelling way to frame this work is to share the stories of success and the case studies that really illustrate a very different way of working. And you'll see the way I frame the principles is this versus another. So the network principles versus what traditionally happens. You probably noticed that they're quite counterintuitive in some ways, that we typically see an emphasis on organizations and building big brands and taking credit for everything that you've done, and kind of top-down control mechanisms, and organizations competing to be the leading player in their fields. That's kind of the dominant model in many nonprofit sectors globally, I believe. And the network model really turns it on its head and says, what does it take? What do we need to build communities and to develop networks that are really thriving and supporting each other? And it's trust and humility and a focus on the cause rather than individual institutional success. So those principles don't really come alive for people until they hear of specific examples. And I use many of the case studies that I've written and developed, but at the same time, this work and this approach has been going on long before I came along, long before collective impact, for decades, if not since people have been working in organizations. That this approach is perhaps under-recognized and underappreciated, but it's happening in all our communities. And it's a matter of identifying those and finding them and raising visibility for them and giving them support and the attention they deserve, because so often these are unsung heroes that are achieving amazing work, but not seeking the credit and not self-promoting about it. So I think it's finding those examples, whether it's your peers or other instances you've seen in other sectors that really kind of model the type of community that you're trying to build. Those are the things that will hopefully sell funders on perhaps a different model of how they identify potential grantees and how they engage with them over the life of the grant.
Thank you. And Kathy, what would you like to share with Jane? Any comments, thoughts from you?
Sure. Thank you, Jane. I want to say thank you for this. This has been really, really interesting. And I was really struck in your description of the Habitat Egypt case study. And you sort of said it again, where these principles are really embedded and characteristic of these really functional and healthy networks. And what you're talking about now is sort of advocating for people to adapt to these principles and use them as a strategy in their own work. And so I kind of want to go back to that question a couple of slides ago about, any situations where these principles really wouldn't be appropriate, or they might not work as well in certain situations. So I just want to ask you to address that a little bit more specifically, if you can, about whether or not there are situations where these principles aren't really well aligned with an organization's approach or mission, or I'm not quite sure how to say that, but you understand what I'm saying, Jane?
So when these principles don't apply?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, actually, and I think, unfortunately, my sense is that the current dominant norm in the philanthropic sector, at least in the US where I'm most familiar, is that these principles are they aren't consistent with the status quo. As I'd mentioned, that there is a tremendous emphasis in our field on what is your budget size, how big is your organization, how big of a footprint, what recognition have you gotten for your work, what's how powerful is your brand. That model of the institution is the solution. These network principles, and frankly, many of the practitioners that I've studied and learned from, they often are flying under the radar doing this work. They're not getting big grants or a lot of attention, or it was never easy, right? But to them, working in this way was the only path to getting to large-scale impact and sustainable impact and leveraged impact. So they began working in this way and have gotten pretty compelling results. And I suppose it's fortunate that I've been able to help give them some of the recognition for that work. But I would say there is a big tension in the field between these types of principles, particularly in the kind of business world where I come from, and because I've always been housed in a business school where we focus on kind of competitive success and growth. And there's this assumption that all of those things are the hallmarks of impact. But in fact, now that I've seen so many examples of organizations, networks, communities that have gotten tremendous impact without necessarily a gigantic institution to get to that, it suggests to me that this is just an alternative path to getting to the impact that we're all after in the field. And it's going to take a lot of change. And that's actually what I'm focused on, is trying to change the culture in the broader field of social impact work, so that these types of examples aren't just the exception, but rather someday I hope that they'll be the norm, that we can't imagine working just institution by institution in competition with each other and worrying about our proprietary knowledge and our market share and our brand recognition. That is what I think is actually poisoning our ability to get to large scale, successful, thriving collaborations and communities that want to work together. Because I would have to say one of my concerns about, say, collective impact approach is it is largely funder driven. And funding is a very blunt tool for getting people to work together. It may work as long as the funding is there, but if people don't live and work according to these principles and their engagement and interaction with each other, there's not likely to be that compelling desire or motivation to come back and continue to invest in the network if the money somehow, and it usually eventually does, disappear.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Thanks. And we do just have a few more minutes, and unfortunately we lost Sarah Milgren-Toffler's video. I'm not sure if she's able to connect audially, but let's go to Jose and see if what final comments would you like to make to Jane?
Yes, thank you. So some of the things that definitely have stood out to me, and these are the kind of questions that I myself get, or the work that we do, right? Talking about how do you exist as an organization compared to as a community and as a network? How are you able to accomplish X, Y, Z amount of work without funding support? Mm-hmm. What is it that attracts the work that you're doing to others that want to commit to this work? So really, for me, the things that stood out that I really want to highlight, one is, like you said, it's not easy. There is not easy, and it's easy to kind of see how, like you said, the path to growth is through maybe a perceived expected path. But by thinking about saying, okay, if I choose to focus on what my culture and community is versus a system and organization and what that structure looks like, when I choose to build on relationship and community building versus really being prescriptive about how something should go, I think this is where a lot of the learning has come into play. And I know a lot of the questions as I was seeing the questions from a lot of the audience were around that, right? Like, you find yourself at these forks in the road, and like, what is it going to convince me or push me to think that I am pursuing a network model approach that is getting me this success versus not sure if, it's easy to be like, see all the other signs to try to push me the other way. So I really appreciate this, and I think work like this helps a lot.
And I think one of the things that's helpful is to find a peer group of like-minded others that believe in this way of working. And that's personally how I've done this work as well, is that over time, I've developed a wonderful group of amazing network catalysts, and I continue to dialogue with them as I develop and advance this research to always get a reality check also and make sure that it makes sense, and see if and how I can be most helpful to them also, because that is really why I do the work. So similarly in your work, if you have peers, and I know everybody has their day jobs and it's hard to spend extra time building that network, but I think it's enormously it's helpful to have that group to bounce ideas off of. And in fact, I had a convening in the spring at Berkeley of about a dozen network leaders, many of whom I've profiled in case studies, to have them meet each other, because usually they're working in their respective fields on their own, but don't have a network of other like-minded network catalysts that see their work in this way. And it's hard not to get sidetracked and get tempted by a potential grant that might seem to be the next step to getting to impact, and always asking yourself those hard questions and juggling all of the tensions, again, because this approach by far is rarer than it should be, I believe.
Well, thanks, Jane. And you can see from the chat and hear from comments that Kathy and Jose are making that there are lots more questions and lots more discussion that people would like to have with you. So we really appreciate your time here, and we look forward to scheduling sometime probably after the first of the year, a follow-up webinar with you. So before we wrap things up, do you want to just say a few words about the resources here that you're
Sure, absolutely. So I see one of the questions is asking the difference between Principle 1 and 4, and I have a number of other articles that illustrate and lay out the case or kind of clarify each of these, and you'll see that all the 4 principles are in virtually every single one of these articles. And the first is geared toward funders, the 4 principles, network principles of collaboration success. I have currently have a blog with Stanford Social Innovation Review. It's actually happening right now. We're on our third of a series of 9 blogs that we're doing on Stanford Social Innovation Review online, where I've written the introductory piece, and colleagues and I, David Ehrlichman and David Sawyer, the 3 of us, have worked to curate and identify network leaders to share their own experiences in their own words in a guest blog, to share their stories, and that illustrates the 4 principles. So those are happening once a week. We're in our second one, I believe, our second guest blog. So if you look at the series in its entirety, and it's due to wrap up end of October, that you'll see these 4 principles illustrated over and over again through different case examples. And that, again, is where they really come to life. And that's how I learn them. They're not my idea. It's not my invention. These are the wisdom. This is the wisdom that I've distilled from those practitioners. So that's the blog series. And then Cracking the Network Code is a more detailed and lengthy document. It's about 40 pages that goes through each of the 4 principles. Again, illustrates with detailed case examples. So I think that will address a lot of the questions that people might have about differences between the principles. Networked Nonprofit is an early piece that I wrote that was a precursor to the 4 principles, where I was trying to articulate this way of working that was different from the typical growth trajectory. So you'll see a lot of the network principles there, but at that point, that was one of my earlier pieces. I myself hadn't actually articulated all of those 4 principles, but it's still good background, and you'll see the Habitat Egypt case profiled in that as well. And finally, the question about the collective impact link and how it's related, the FSG guest blog will also give you a sense of how FSG sees the linkage between this work and theirs. So, and I've got more. So you can find my email and send me a request, and I can send you more articles and case studies, and be happy to engage with you, because this is, again, what I'm most passionate about, and I'm always eager to support and engage practitioners to do this work and do it well. So thanks.
Great. Well, thank you. It's so critically needed in our area of reconnecting children to nature, but in many other areas as well. So we appreciate your research with this and your sharing. And we will make this recording available to everyone, as well as the resources that are here. This slide will be on there. So we do just have a couple of quick announcements, and Sarah Milligan-Toppler is still on the line, but unfortunately we're having another tech problem and we can't get audio from her. So just wanted to invite people to the next webinar, where our special guest speaker will be June Holly, and she is the person who has written the guide to network weaving. And you'll be getting an invitation probably tomorrow or the next day about that, and it'll tell you all about that webinar, which will be equally as enlightening as Jane's work. I know Jane and June know each other, and so their work is built on each other and is very complementary. And then the last announcement is to invite all of you to the conference, the Children in Nature Network International Conference in St. Paul next May 25th through 27th. You can go to the Children in Nature Network website and see us at a beautiful location on the river in St. Paul at the River Center. And one of the tracks at the conference will be on growing successful grassroots networks. So this conversation will continue there, and please check that out. And just really thank everybody on the call for your interest. Somehow we want to find out what you're doing also and learn from each other that way. So this feels like a really good beginning, and we really appreciate, Jane, you laying kind of the foundation for us all to think about growing our network.
Thank you. I appreciate having the opportunity. It's really a privilege.
Yeah. And thanks, Jose. Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Sarah, for being on.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.